All right, this is Scat Chapter 3. The students, groggy and rumpled, gathered shortly after dawn in the school parking lot. Nick was sitting alone on the curb when Marta walked up. "You okay?" she asked. "Just tired is all. He'd been on the computer since 4 a.m., but no emails from his father in Iraq." Marta sat down. "Where's Smoke?" "Haven't seen him," Nick said. "Good. Maybe he quit school. He's old enough to drive. He's got to be old enough to drop out, right?" "Don't get your hopes up." Marta said, "I'm sorry, but he seriously scares me." "Worse than her?" "No way," said Nick. Mrs. Starch had arrived wide awake and in high spirits. She wore wading boots, stiff canvas pants, a baggy lounge shirt, and a frayed straw hat under her unturned veil of mosquito netting. Mrs. Starch always was prepared for the worst. "Slather up, people," she barked. "Sunblock, bug juice, lip balm. It's a jungle out there." Nick and Marta got in line for the bus. "Maybe she'll be bit by a scorpion," Marta muttered. "That'd be awful," Nick whispered. "For the scorpion." Mrs. Starch whistled sharply. "Did everybody in my classes remember to bring their journals?" She held a black writing notebook above her head. "Keep a list of everything you see. Insects, mammals, birds, trees. This will count as a lab grade." Graham, who was dressed like a pint-sized version of Crocodile Hunter, raised his hand. Mrs. Starch ignored him, as always. "We have 3 portable first aid kits," she went on, "and each teacher will be carrying one. If you get in a situation where you need help, speak up right away. Remember, stay with your hiking teams, do not wander off, and most importantly, be respectful towards this very special place that we are exploring. Turn off your cell phones. If I or any other teachers hear one ringing, it will be confiscated." Mrs. Starch put down the black notepad and picked up a device that Nick recognized as a portable boat horn. They made loud, gassy honks and were the favorite toy of a drunken idiot at the Buccaneers football games. Nick's dad had season tickets. "This will be our emergency signal," said Mrs. Starch, demonstrating the boat horn with a short, ear-splitting beep. "If you hear that sound, immediately line up behind your teacher and proceed straight back to the bus. Any questions?" Graham hopped up and down, waving one arm. Mrs. Starch stared past him. "All right, people," she said, clapping. "Let's enjoy our day at the Black Vine Swamp." The bus was roomy and clean and air conditioning, unlike the one we rode to school. Nick and Marta sat together at the front, their backpacks stowed under their seats. Marta nudged Nick and pointed out the window. Mrs. Starch was getting into her car, one of those teardrop-shaped hybrid models that ran on both electricity and gasoline. It had a Save the Manatee license plate. "I guess she left her broomstick at home," Marta said. Nick thought it was odd that Mrs. Starch wasn't riding out to the swamp with everyone else. He wondered if rather what happened the day before she might not want to be on the bus with Smoke. But to Nick and Marta's relief, Smoke was nowhere to be seen. The other science teachers, Mr. Neal and Mrs. Moffett, moved up and down the aisle, collecting forms from each of the students. The forms, which were signed by the parents, said that it wasn't the school's fault if their kid got hurt on the field trip. "I almost called in sick. I do not like swamps," Marta confided to Nick. He said, "I hope we see a panther." "Are you crazy?" "Seriously, that'd be so cool." Never in the recorded history of Florida had a panther harmed a human being. Now there were fewer than 100 of the big cats left in the whole state. "I got a video camera," Nick said, "just in case." Marta said her mother wanted to bring home a ghost orchard. I said, "Yeah, right, Mom, it's against the law." And she goes, "But I'll take good care of it." And I'm like, "You want me to go to jail or what? Give me a break." Nick could tell that Marta was in a better mood because Mrs. Starch wasn't on the bus. The absence of Smoke was a bonus. "How's your dad?" Marta asked, which caught Nick off guard. "He's okay. When's he going to get back?" 22 days. Nick hadn't told Marta any other friends that his father had been sent to Iraq. The Naples newspaper had published the names of those serving in the war zone, and the list had been posted on the bulletin board outside Truman Gym. "And after that, he's home for good, right?" Marta asked. "I sure hope." Nick put on his iPod, and Marta put on hers. The ride took almost an hour because a truck full of tomatoes had flipped over on State Road 29, blocking traffic. A fire engine crew was hosting the ketchup-colored muck off the pavement. Nick spotted a dead buck on the side of the road, and he figured that the tomato truck must have struck it in the early fog, and he wondered if the deer had been running from the panther. Eventually, the bus made a slow turn onto a rutted dirt track that was very narrow. Twice the bus had to pull over to let a flatbed truck pass from the opposite direction. Nick noticed that both trucks had red diamond-shaped logos on the doors and looked brand new. They barely slowed at all, churning dust in their rambling by the bus. The wet prairies that usually glistened in the morning had turned brownish and crisp with the rainfall. Ahead, Nick could see the rising tree line that marked the edge of the black vine swamp. He dug into his backpack for a tube of sunblock, and he smeared some of his on his arms and neck. "Don't forget your nose," Marta said. "Here, let me do it." "No, that's so—" "Hush!" She snatched the tube, squirted a dollop on the white goo of his palm in one hand, and then carefully coated each square inch of Nick's face, like it was a painting on a mask. He was terrified that the other kids might see what she was doing. "Now it's my turn," Marta announced, tugging off her iPod. "What?" She handed him the tube and shut her eyelids tightly. "Careful, that stuff burns if it drips on your eyeballs." Nick felt trapped. He hunkered low into his seat. Marta said, "My uncle got basal cells all the time. That's a kind of skin cancer. They cut them off at the doctor's office." Nick hastily smeared the sunblock cream on Marta's cheeks and forehead. "Okay," he said in a low voice, "you're good." "Ears too," she told him. "Aw, come on. What's your problem, Nick? I'm sorry, but if it runs in my family, basal cells. You can ask my mom." He couldn't say so, but touching your skin felt weird. Not bad, just weird. Afterwards, Marta checked herself out in the driver's rearview mirror and make sure Nick hadn't missed any exposed places. "Good job," she said. "Now that wasn't so awful." For the rest of the trip, Nick pretended to be fascinated by the view out the window. Finally, the bus jaunted to a stop and the kids piled out. Mrs. Starch was waiting, and the mosquito veil wasn't quite long enough to cover her jutting chin, leaving her vivid anvil-shaped scar on display. Beneath the mesh, she wore an enormous purple sunglasses that made her look like a mutant dragonfly. "Come on, people, get organized," she said, clapping again and starting to pace. Each teacher had a team of 15 students. The kids milled around anxiously while their names were called out. Nobody wanted to be on Mrs. Starch's team because they knew that Mrs. Starch would make them work harder than the other teachers. The whole point of going on the field trip was to goof off. Marta leaned close to Nick and said, "If she calls on me, I swear to God, I'm going to fake a heart attack." But by some small miracle, it was Mr. Neal who called out Marta's name and then Nick's. They had been spared. Mrs. Starch led the whole group down the winding boardwalk through the shrub and the pineland hammock into the thicker woods. There, in the cool shade of an ancient bald cypress tree, the boardwalk ended. The team split up in separate directions. Above the treetops, the sky shone bright and cloudless. Despite the drought, there was still enough water in the Strand to make a hike a soggy challenge. The students had been advised to wear long pants to protect their legs and to wear old sneakers that could be thrown away after the trip. Only Graham had been foolish enough to show up in shorts, and soon as his shins looked like they had been clawed by a tomcat. Mr. Neal's specialty was botany, and every so often he paused to point out a plant or a shrub of local interest. Mindful of Mrs. Starch's instructions, Nick and Marta would be automatically pulled out their journals from their backpack and took notes. By the time they stopped for the first rest break, their species list had included pond apple trees, strangler figs, lured oaks, wax myrtles, shamble palms, wild coffee, and resurrection ferns. Animal life was more exclusive. Mr. Neal spotted a barreled owl high up in the tree, and later a young red-bellied turtle basking on the mossy log. Graham shrieked at the sight of the ribbon snake that had somehow mistook for a poisonous cottonmouth. Marta and two other girls briefly got tangled in a tent-sized spider web, while a boy named Mickey Maris captured a green anvil lizard that Mr. Neal made him release on the spot. Nick, who was scouting for signs of panthers, came across a fresh pig track. Not so much else. Occasionally, he could hear the other students' teams as they moved in the distance throughout the swamp. Once he was certain he picked up Mrs. Starch's voice yodeling, "We are now in the Broomland heaven." At noon, Mr. Neal's group sat down for lunch beneath a crooked cypress that he estimated was 500 years old. The kids had brought their own sandwiches. Nick's was turkey and cheese. Marta's was peanut butter and Nutella. They shared a lime Gatorade, and Nick's mother had packed in a padded cooler bag. Addressing the team, Mr. Neal said, "Can anyone tell me why we're not getting bothered by mosquitoes?" Graham's hand shot up. He looked flabbergasted when Mr. Neal actually called on him. Because, yes, Graham? Because, go on, Graham shrugged in defeat. "I don't have a clue." Mr. Neal pointed. "Rachel?" "Because the weather's been too dry for skeeters," Rachel said. "A good theory," teacher said, "but there's still plenty of water for the little boogers to lay their eggs in. Nick Waters, what's your guess?" Nick wasn't paying attention. He was thinking about his father. Marta elbowed him, and he looked up, flustered, and said, "What? I didn't hear the question." "Why are we not getting chewed up by mosquitoes?" Mr. Neal asked with a touch of impatience. Marta decided to return Nick's favor from the day before. She cut herself into the discussion and said, "Because mosquito fish are eating up all the baby mosquitoes." "Excellent." Mr. Neal looked relieved that somebody got it right. "Now I've got a question," Marta said. "Why do they call it the Black Vine Swamp when all the vines we've seen are green?" Graham raised his hand to try, and then another student groaned. Mr. Neal said, "I'm not sure I know the answer to that one. Anybody got a theory?" At that moment, they heard a piercing cry rise from among the towering cypresses. It didn't sound like any other noise that a person could make. Mr. Neal was startled by the hikers, although he tried not to show it. He raised a finger to his lip as a signal for everyone to stay quiet. A woodpecker hammering on a dead shrub stopped abruptly and flittered away. Some of the kids got spooked, but Nick was excited. He thought he knew what kind of animal he heard. He grabbed the video camera from his backpack and, after grouping it to locate the record button, aimed the lens towards the part of the woods where the wild cry had come. It was hard to make out details through the viewfinder because of the forest shadows and because Nick's hands were shaking slightly. Marta had edged closer, peeking over his shoulder. "You see that? See it?" He pointed at the screen of the viewfinder. Something was running among the tree trunks, a large, tannish blur. "Where'd it go?" Marta whispered. "Where was that?" "Just wait," Nick said, and then there was no other movement. Moments later, the students heard splashes and then a heavy rustling that faded into silence. Nobody made a peep until Mrs. Neal spoke. "Probably just a fox or a wild hog. Nothing to worry about," he said, not sounding too sure about himself. Nick switched off the camera. "That was too big for a fox. I bet it was a panther." Not all the other kids shared their curiosity about big cats, and some of them expressed dismay of possibility crossing one's path. Mickey Maris stood up and declared that they should all march back to the bus at once. Mr. Neal said, "I doubt seriously that was a panther." "What about a bear?" Graham said. "They've got black bears out here. Mrs. Starch said so." While Mr. Neal tried to calm the students, Nick fiddled with the control menu on the video camera. He wanted to replay the tape in slow speed so he could get a better look at the creature. Marta tweaked his arm. "Hey, do you smell something?" Nick looked up from the camera and said, "That's smoke," he said. "Definitely." And just like that, they heard two long blasts from Mrs. Starch's boat horn. Everybody began murmuring and clustering around Mrs. Neal, who told them to follow him back to the boardwalk as quickly as possible, but no running, he said, and no talking. The students didn't have to be told twice. Hurriedly, they zipped out their book bags, lined them up behind the teacher, who led them briskly along the same wet, peat-filled slough that they had came in. The smoky odor grew heavier, and in some places a gray haze was visible through the trees. After assembling at the boardwalk, the three teams merged to form a long single line. At the very end of it was Mrs. Starch, who burped the air horn to make the students turn around and pay attention. "Listen up, people," she said. "A small wildfire has sprung up on the far edge of the swamp. Pretty common for this time of the year. It'll probably burn out before it reaches the cypress muck. But there's no sense in taking any chances. That's why we're cutting our field trip short and heading back to school, straight back to school." Marta groaned and leaned against Nick. "What if she makes us all go to her class? I'm going to be sick again, all over the place." "Pray for a flat tire on the way home," Nick said. He was disappointed because he had hoped for another opportunity to see the panther or whatever it was that he had heard and seen darting down the cypress shadows. However, a wildfire was nothing to fool with. If a strong wind kicked up, the blaze would race across the land faster than any human could possibly run. "Please stay in a line behind Mr. Neal and Mrs. Moffett," Mrs. Starch said. "I'll be coming along in a minute. Libby dropped her medicine, and I'm going back to find it." She clapped so loudly that it sounded like a paper bag popping. Now get in your fannies and gear. Move. At that time, nobody questioned Mrs. Starch's decision to go back. Libby Marshall had frequent asthma attacks, and she always carried an inhaler. The haze from the fire would make it hard for her to breathe. Quickly and quietly urged Mrs. Moffett to the kids to begin streaming towards the bus. Nick was walking behind Marta, who was behind Graham, who was behind Mickey Maris, who was behind Rachel, who was behind Hector, the star of the soccer team. The students were in such a rush that they were stepping on each other's heels. Nick lost one of his sneakers in the overturn in the boy next in line, an algebra ace named Jean, who stepped around him and kept going. When Nick knelt to retrieve his shoe, he glanced back down the boardwalk just in time to see Mrs. Starch in her straw hat and her dragonfly glasses marching alone into the smoky swamp. He had no idea that she wouldn't be coming out. End of chapter 3.